Yes, my parents came to Salisbury as refugees after the troubles after the Second World War, and they arrived in Adelaide and went to the Woodside Army Camp, and after some time they settled in Salisbury North in the new Housing Trust estate. Well, for them, when they arrived, they settled in that new estate in 1954, and it was newly built, and so there was no infrastructure at the time, and so the houses were built, but there were no roads or any other sewerage and things like that. And so they had a night cart man that came once a week to clear out the effluent that they had in the backyard, and the bloke's name was Pop Roberts, and he lived in Paternoster Row, opposite the train station in Salisbury, and he was also the local bus driver. I went to Salisbury North Primary School, and I was very fortunate that I only lived a couple of hundred metres from the school, and so I would be able to go home for lunch every day. But being from European parents, I would have a full 3-course meal for lunch with a tablecloth set, and my grandma and mum and me would have lunch together, and if Dad was around, not at work, he would join us for lunch as well. And it gave me just enough time to eat my lunch, fill my belly to over full, and I'd have just enough time to run back to school before the school bell rang to resume classes after lunch. I enjoyed primary school, but I didn't really enjoy being there because all through my school life, I always felt there were better things to do than go to school. There was more fun doing things away from school than at school. Well, as a little kid, I always liked things like trucks and trains and things like that. We actually lived near the train line. We lived near the train line that went from Salisbury to Port Pirie. And so I loved trains as a kid. And I also liked doing things and being active and working. And so when the contractors came and laid down the concrete for the new curbing and the bitumen, I had more interest in working and watching what they were doing rather than go to school. And as a matter of fact, they were very kind, and the contractors who were laying the curbs and putting the bitumen down, they invited me to jump in the truck with them, and so I'd be going to various depots and filling up trucks and emptying trucks as a kid, so I was very lucky doing that. They were just interests of mine as a kid, and that extended throughout my life. Yeah, well, as a child, I loved to draw, as many kids do, and that was subject matter that I really enjoyed capturing. The trucks and trains from my daily life that I saw every day. I lived halfway between the primary school and halfway between the high school and the other way, and so again at high school I still went home for lunch every day and had the same 3-course meals, but I was more reluctant to return to high school when I was there because I didn't like it, and so I'd wait for the school bell to ring, and I could hear it from my home, and then I'd run back to school in the afternoon, and more often than not I would not go back after lunch because I didn't like being there. We had a lot of celebrations at home in that my parents were very sociable people, and of course the community that they came to Australia with was very small, and so they tried to maintain as much connection with those people as possible. And so when they got together, there was always a big party. And so things like Christmas we had with our family, but because my father worked as a chef, he cooked a lot of Australian meals for people, and so therefore our family celebrations like Christmas time was always a mix of the old Italian type food, but a lot of Australian type food as well. And so we had things like a roast chicken for Christmas, along with some lasagna, and they were the kind of integrated meals that we used to have. I loved school holidays because I didn't have to go to school, but I spent my school holidays mostly at home, riding my bike and visiting friends. And I can remember during school holidays, like many children, getting bored. And it was just a time where you did nothing and you were sort of bored and you look for things to do. But I used to spend a lot of time what we called down the creek, which was the Little Para River. And at the time, there were many water holes, particularly in summertime, that were still full of water. And we'd use our time down there, we'd swim in the water holes, but mysteriously people would put up ropes into the gum tree boughs and make rope swings. And we never knew how they got there, but they were just there. And so we'd use these rope swings to swing from the bank and crash into the river. It was great fun. And that was when the Salisbury swimming pool had just opened in 1966. And so we would either get money to go to the pool, but we'd save our money to go to the pool and go to the creek instead and spend our money elsewhere. Oh, and we would have spent our money on lollies. As a child, there was entertainment always at home with my parents because they had lots of functions and parties at home, or we'd go and visit their friends and have parties there. But entertainment generally for me was playing in the street with all the street kids, with all the kids from the street. We played in the street a lot, and we make our own fun. We lived near the train line that went from Salisbury to Port Pirie, and so on the side of the train line, we'd build big dirt tracks for our push bikes, and we'd build jumps along the train line there. And so we would build jumps and ride our bikes in the train line and watch the trains go past, or we mostly played near the river. I went to Salisbury High School, which was close to where I lived, and I didn't really like school, as I've mentioned in the past about primary school, not liking that either. But high school was a place where I sort of had to go rather than where I wanted to go. And even though I liked my teachers and they liked me, and I had many friends there, I just felt that when I went to high school that the things they were teaching me weren't things that I was interested in learning. And one of my teachers, Mr. Williams, he was really good because he would frame the school subjects or what we were studying at the time around things that I might be interested in. So he'd say, Richard, if we had 6 cattle in one pen and 3 sheep in another, which would make it interesting to me. And that made it much more interesting for me to learn. I became interested in livestock because my sister's friends had a large cattle property at Tintinara in the southeast, and I used to go down there every school holiday, or not every school holidays, but many school holidays. I'd go down to this property at southeast, and where I learned the craft of animal husbandry and looking after livestock. And so it became an interest of mine that I very much liked. And so when I finally left high school, I got a job at the stockyards at Jepps Cross and became a stockman. I'm the youngest of 5 children, and when I was growing up at high school, my brothers and sisters worked in Salisbury. My brother worked for Mr. Miller, the milkman, who delivered milk throughout Salisbury North, and at that time there were fewer safety issues that needed to be looked at. So you'd be able to ride on the wheel arch of the trailer with your legs hanging over the wheels. And my sister, she worked at the newsagent, and my eldest sister, she worked at the telephone exchange in Salisbury behind the post office. And because when we were kids, no one had phones in their homes at the time, and there was one lady at the end of our street, Mrs. Barnes, she was the only person that had the phone. And so my sister, working at the telephone exchange, if she wanted to talk to Mum, she'd ring Mrs. Barnes, and Mrs. Barnes would walk up to our place and say there's a phone call for her, and then Mum would walk back to Mrs. Barnes' place to take the call. That's funny. At high school, despite me being a visual artist, and that's my vocation today, I didn't do much drawing at school or didn't do much art. I did like at high school doing English. That was my favourite subject. And so I'm very pleased with that because another hobby of mine is the English language, and that's what I really enjoy. I also enjoyed tech studies because that's where you'll be able to sort of do things with your hands and make stuff. So I did enjoy that as well. At 16, I was in year 11 and I left school that year, and I just felt that the pathways to go further to year 12 were not available to me. And so I was very fortunate because I was looking forward to Christmas holidays, and we finished school on the Friday, and on the Sunday I saw a man that I knew, and he offered me a job working at the Jepps Cross stockyards, and I started the next day on the Monday. So I didn't get to have school holidays with my friends, but I managed to have a much better life and holidays, because going to work was like being on holidays, because I loved my job. In my job I was a stockman, and I worked in the cattle market at Jepps Cross, and was responsible for moving livestock in and out of the market. And we fed cattle, and we loaded them onto trains and trucks, and we unloaded them from trucks and trains that came from various parts of South Australia. My first job as a stockman at the Jepps Cross sale yards encompassed an area that was from the Jepps Cross intersection all the way to Parafield Gardens and what is now the suburb of Mawson Lakes, and all the way up to Paraka, and all the way down to almost the mangroves west of the Port Wakefield Road. And so we were responsible for moving sheep and cattle through all those areas. And what was interesting was that in those days I was paid in cash from my boss, but he'd have to go to the Cavern Hotel every Friday afternoon after work, and that's where I got paid. And even though I was a young man and wasn't legally able to drink alcohol, I still had to go to the pub to collect my pay, and so I'd have a lemonade or something there with him. And if we ever wanted something to eat, we used to go to the Cavern steak van, which was in the car park of the hotel. And what was funny about that was that because we were stockmen from across the road, the lady's name was Phyllis, who worked in the steak van. She would give us a discount, but we'd have to have the crusts of the bread on our steak sandwiches. When I was very little, my grandma used to take me for a walk every afternoon, and she'd invariably take me to the Salisbury railway station, and we'd sit on the platform and watch all the trains go past, because in those days there were many trains that travelled to the country areas as well, unlike today. And so Mr. Brooks was the station assistant at the station, and he was very kind to me. My grandma couldn't speak English and she was deaf, and so I spoke to her in lip reading and with gestures. And so Mr. Brooks was very nice to my grandmother and me, and he'd take me to the signal cabin, and we got to sort of play with all the levers and things like that when I was a little boy. And he'd have, in summertime, there were large canvas bags of water hanging off the veranda at the train station, and so he'd get the cup, the metal enamel cup, and he'd lower it and get the water from the cup, and I'd get a cold drink from the canvas water bag at the station. And no one ever bothered about different lips touching the cups, it's just what you did. And so I remember those days very fondly with my grandma at the station. A lot of my subject matter that I paint draws upon almost like a visual diary from my life. And so Salisbury features very prominently in a lot of my subject matter, because what I'm doing is capturing aspects of my life as a child and my years of growing up in Salisbury. And there are many images that I have painted that are no longer existent. And so in a way I feel that I've captured history. One of the things that I would like to have captured more, but perhaps didn't, were the orange groves that were all through Salisbury. And they're no longer there, and I lament not having captured those in one of my paintings or several paintings of mine. But that's an unfortunate part that no longer exists of Salisbury. I really loved my job at the Jepps Cross sale yards working as a stockman, and we worked long hours, and as a consequence of that I was able to save some money, and my boss suffered a heart attack and he couldn't work anymore, and so I was in a position to buy his business when I was 17 years old. So I became a livestock droving contractor, which I really enjoyed doing, and I had a number of employees, and I was responsible to them as well. But unfortunately, not long after I bought my business, I had a horse riding accident in the stockyards where I was knocked from a horse and broke my neck and became a quadriplegic. Unfortunately, I could never go back to working at the stockyards, which I loved so much, and so I started sketching and drawing, and that became my vocation. Sometimes at night when I can't sleep, instead of counting sheep, I try and fall asleep by walking along John Street, Salisbury, of my childhood. And what I do, I start at the railway station and walk along the eastern side of John Street and try and name all the shops from the train station down to Commercial Road, and then I cross over Commercial Road at the Salisbury Hotel and try and work my way back of all the houses and all the shops along John Street back to the train station, and invariably before I get back to the train station I'm asleep. And some of the shops that I walk past when I try and get to sleep, I start with the Savings Bank of South Australia on the corner of Gawler Street, and then there's Dixon's Deli and Mr Coombe the dentist, and the Bank of Adelaide, the Commercial Bank, Shergis Hair Salons, the fruit and vegetable shop, Aisha's hardware shop on the corner of Church Street, and all the way along, because after that there was a church and there was no parabanks. And so it was Mr Bowie, the mayor. He lived on John Street, where Parabanks is now. And then there was John Harvey's original home. And then we get to the top of Commercial Road. We cross over at the Salisbury Hotel. And we walk back along towards Ann Street. And then there was the council chambers and the big park that was the oval for the Salisbury Primary School. And then we get back to Hoffman's Bakery on the corner of Church Street. And then we get back to what was the new post office on the corner. And then there was the Salisbury Arcade, the Commonwealth Bank on the corner of Judd Lane, and there was National Bank on the other corner of Judd Lane. And then we had the Ascot buildings, which are 2-storey buildings. And then we had the Tom the Cheap. Then we had Delo's Deli, Delo's News Agency. Then we had the Romeo's jewellery shop, and Bob Nagel's shops that he owned. He was the barber there. And then we had Pretty John's Menswear and Mrs Piper, the dry cleaner. And then we had Rice's hardware shop and the Governor Mac. I mean, I've left a few out because there are so many more, but they are the ones that highlight. Oh, and I forgot to mention, there was also the Salisbury Drapers and Darling's Deli. And I forgot to mention also the Wright's Shoe Shop that had 2 entrances, one for the male shoes and one for female shoes. So he had 2 entrances. And Mr Wright's shop was quite large. It went all the way back to James Lane, which was behind Salisbury, John Street, yes. And then there was I think there was like an accountancy or electrical store on John Street as well before Church Street, which I didn't mention, yes. And also in Salisbury Arcade, there was a butcher shop, and also there was a small deli. But inside there was a book exchange and a couple of hairdressers and some accountancies. And Mr Cinciala, he used to own the sewing machine shop in Salisbury Arcade. Yes. A number of shops that I used to frequent as a kid was Pretty John's Menswear, because they sold clothes, and so I used to get my clothes from there. But also the Salisbury Drapers sold school uniforms, and so I was able to buy grey trousers and grey shirts and Salisbury High School jumpers from the Drapers in Salisbury. But also there were a couple of lolly shops in the main street, which we also used to like to go and spend money at. When I was a kid, 2 very prominent establishments in John Street for my family were the 2 hotels. The Governor Macdonald Hotel near the railway station, and the Salisbury Hotel, which is the opposite end of John Street on the corner of Commercial Road. My dad frequented them every day. He drank at the Salisbury Hotel every night, and on Saturday mornings he'd spend his time at the Governor Macdonald Hotel, because his SP bookmaker, Bob Nagel, was the bloke he went to see. And what was funny about my dad, he played 8-ball at the pub each night at the Salisbury Hotel. And so if he was late coming home for dinner, my mum would ring the pub to find out where he was, and the publican Snow would always say, "He's just left." And that was his refrain, that any time somebody rang, he'd tell their wives, "He just left." and it was up to them what they did before they got home.
That's lovely.
Beside the train station was Heidenreich's flour mill, and further along Gawler Street were the grain silos. And my brothers and sisters, when they were younger, they used to play in the grain silos and climb the rafters and jump into the wheat that was being stored there. I was never game enough to do that because I knew of the problems with quicksand and you could suffocate and die. I don't know how they managed to do it without any incident, but they always recall how much they enjoyed doing that. My dad loved fishing, and he had a small boat, and he was a member of the St Kilda Boat Club. And so I used to enjoy, when I knew he was going out fishing, if I didn't go with him, I would ride my bike to St Kilda, and I'd play in the mangroves that are down there, which I really, really love so much, and they're very important. And so when he would come in with a boat, I'd put my bike in the back of the boat and get a lift home back with him so I didn't have to ride back. But riding to St Kilda was always a challenge because it was a fair distance from Salisbury North. But I loved the mangroves so much, I loved playing in them, and very much enjoyed that. One of the celebrations I really loved each year was Australia Day, because Salisbury had a big parade down John Street where they'd have characters dressed up in different costumes and bands and so forth. And then what they did, they'd sort of go down John Street and make their way to Salisbury Oval, because every year there was the big Australia Day event, or what would you call it, big event at Salisbury Oval where they had food for sale and things like that. But it was a big celebration on Australia Day. But I recall mostly one day the fire trucks from the Salisbury Fire Station were going down John Street in the big parade, and the fire alarm went off at the Salisbury station, which was like a big air raid warning siren. And so the CFS trucks from the Salisbury Fire Station had to quickly divert from the parade and turn and do a U-turn and go off to the fire. So they missed out on completing the parade down the street. One of the celebrations in Salisbury I really enjoyed when I was growing up was Australia Day, because Salisbury would put on a big parade down John Street, and where they'd have all these floats with people dressed up and bands and other personalities going down the main street, and they'd eventually wend their way to the Salisbury Oval, because at Salisbury Oval that day they had a big Australia Day fair where they had trampolines and circus acts and all sorts of things there. But I remember one day watching the parade from the side of the road in John Street, and they had the fire trucks from the Salisbury Fire Station, and the alarm went off at Salisbury Fire Station, which was a big air raid warning siren, and so the firemen on the fire trucks had to quickly divert and do a U-turn from the parade and take off and go into this fire, which held up the parade while they did the U-turn in the main street. After I was injured and couldn't go back to working at the sale yards, I embraced doing some sketching and drawing again, which I really enjoyed. But also at that time, I became involved in wheelchair sports, and that gave me a great level of experience in working in teams with people and working on boards, and I gained a lot of experience from that. And so after I was working with my painting, which I was really enjoying, I had a great opportunity to meet a number of artists which I looked up to, and some of those were Jeff Wilson from South Australia, and David Dowitz is another one, and also some other artists that really looked after me and mentored me. And that gave me the opportunity to work with my art and start selling paintings. And also, to my amazement, in 1997 I was awarded South Australian Citizen of the Year for my work devoted to community and art. And that encouraged me to do more work with the Salisbury High School. Even though I wasn't a very good student there, Salisbury High School was going through a huge transition where Peter Turner became the principal of the school, and he was very, very much corporate minded, And so he wanted to turn the school around and try and encourage local businesses, local industries, the defence industries to invest in Salisbury High School and have its students go and work in different locations for their school holidays and to gain experience, so that the students from Salisbury High School could have a pathway when they left school to go to these industries. And I was very much a part of helping establish that with Peter Turner and his what was then Deputy Principal Helen Parfitis. And I should probably say that with working with the principals and deputy principals back then at Salisbury High School, we were able to start the Salisbury High School Awards Day, where various industries and corporate bodies would provide awards for the students at school. And I was also encouraged and was very happy to do so, and still do, provide funds to give awards to a student each year at the school. In 2008, I was very fortunate to be named one of the Salisbury Living Legends. And that was a huge honour for me because I love Salisbury, and it was a huge fillip for me to receive that award, and it was fantastic. And what happened was that my portrait, huge portrait, was on the side of the wall in Civic Square in Salisbury on John Street. And when it came time to unveil my portrait, it was stuck down with Velcro and it was covered. And so when the time came for me to pull the cord with the Velcro, and so my portrait would be revealed, I didn't have the strength to pull the cord down. So my dad was in the crowd and I asked him to come over and help me pull the cord to unveil my portrait. And that was funny.